This ain't just some story about the Wild West. It's a tale of secrets, silver, and how one desperate woman crashed into a grieving man's quiet life. Get ready because things are about to get wild in Montana. Jed Stone, a rancher hardened by loss, thought he'd seen it all, but even he wasn't ready for the storm that brought a battered, shackled woman right to his gate. She was almost broken, clinging to a heavy sack, her eyes wide with animal terror. She didn't beg for food or shelter, but for something else entirely. "The sack," she rasped, "on my saddle. Please." Jed, a man who swore off the world's troubles after losing his wife Martha and their infant son Daniel 3 years prior, felt a chill creep down his spine. This wasn't some simple plea. This was something deep, something dangerous, and it was about to blow his solitary life sky high. He tried to stay out of trouble, but her desperate plea dug a hook into his soul. He fought the raging storm again, retrieving the heavy, dripping sack from her horse. Back inside by the flickering firelight, she insisted. "Not these," she gasped, shaking her head at her manacled wrists. "The cords! Take them off the sack." A knot of dread tightened in Jed's stomach. What could be so urgent? He cut the cords with his Bowie knife, and the sack fell open. Jed stared, and a sharp gasp escaped his lips. His blood ran cold. The warmth of the fire vanished, replaced by an icy dread that gripped his very soul. This wasn't a common fugitive. This was something else entirely, something terrifying. Inside the sack, there was no gold, no jewels, just a sheath of papers, including a land deed stained with a dark, ugly blotch that could only be dried blood. Beside it lay a small silver locket engraved with the initials AV, and nestled next to that, tarnished and grim, was a deputy's badge. But not just any badge. Jed recognized it instantly. It belonged to Deputy Miller, a young man who, according to the official story, had tragically drowned in the river 2 months ago. And that blood-stained deed? It was for the old Vance property, rumored to be worthless, but Jed knew better. It held the headwaters of Whisper Creek, the only reliable water source for 50 miles. Everything Jed thought he knew about his quiet corner of the world had just been dynamited. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that had just broken inside his house. What in the blazes was going on? The silence was thick, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of the wind. Jed slowly raised his gaze to meet the woman's. Her green eyes were fixed on his, watching for his reaction. "Who are you?" Jed's voice was low, rougher than usual. "My name is Aara Vance," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "The deed. It was my husband's." Vance. Augustus Vance. The wealthy speculator from back east, who'd bought that land site unseen. Folks in town said he was arrogant, that he'd planned a grand estate, then lost interest only to die in a hunting accident. Sheriff Blackwood had called it a tragic, solitary end. "Your husband is dead," Jed stated, the words tasting like ash. A single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. "He didn't die in an accident, Mr. Stone. He was murdered." Jed sat back, knuckles white around his knife handle. "The sheriff said—" "The sheriff is a liar," she interrupted, her voice trembling with grief and rage. "He's the one who killed him." Jed felt a surge of instinctive disbelief. Sheriff Corbin Blackwood, a pillar of the community, a killer? It seemed preposterous. "That's a heavy accusation," Jed said, his tone cautious. "Is it?" Aara pushed herself up further, her eyes flashing. "Or is it a convenient truth for a man who controls what everyone in this valley hears and believes?" She took a shuddering breath and began to speak, her story spilling out in a torrent. She and Augustus hadn't lost interest in the land at all. They had discovered its true worth. Not just the water, which was valuable enough, but something far more lucrative. "Silver," she whispered, the word hanging heavy in the air. Augustus, a geologist, had found a massive vein of silver ore in the northern hills of the property, enough to make them kings. They kept it a secret, planning to bring in their own team from Denver. "But secrets," she said, "have a way of seeping out." Sheriff Blackwood got wind of it. He approached Augustus, claiming to offer protection, but what he wanted was a controlling stake. Augustus refused. He was a proud man, Aara continued, her voice growing hoarse. He told Blackwood he wouldn't be extorted by a backwater lawman. That was his mistake. A week later, Blackwood arrived at their cabin, not alone. He had his young deputy with him, the one whose badge now lay in the sack. Deputy Miller. Blackwood said it was their last chance to make a deal. Augustus ordered them off their land. Blackwood drew his gun. The land wouldn't be worth much to a dead man, he'd snarled. What followed was a chaotic blur of violence. Augustus lunged. The sheriff fired. Aara screamed as her husband fell, clutching the deed to their land. Deputy Miller was horrified. "Sheriff, what have you done?" Aara recounted the deputy's panicked words. "This isn't right." He started to back away, reaching for his own pistol. Blackwood turned on his deputy without a moment's hesitation. "Loose end, son," he'd said, and fired again. In the confusion, as Blackwood reloaded, Aara acted on pure instinct. She grabbed a cast-iron skillet and struck the sheriff across the head. He staggered back, dazed. She ran to Augustus, but he was gone. His blood soaked the deed he still held. She pried it from his fingers. She saw the dead deputy on the floor, and in a moment of crazed clarity, ripped the badge from his vest. She didn't know why, only that it was proof. She grabbed Augustus's locket, his last gift, and she fled. "He put a bounty on my head the next day," she concluded, her body slumping with exhaustion. "Said I was a black widow, that I killed my own husband for his fortune, and murdered a deputy who tried to stop me." She rattled the manacles Jed had just removed. "He put me in these after he and his posse caught up to me near the Crying River. I escaped during a transfer. Stole a horse. I've been running ever since." Jed listened, his expression unreadable. His gaze drifted back to the items on the floor. The bloody deed, the locket, the badge. Why would she take the badge of a man she supposedly murdered? Unless it was, as she claimed, proof. Proof that two men died that day, not one. Proof that the official story was a lie. This was a wild tale, almost unbelievable, but those objects gave it a chilling weight. "What would you do in Jed's boots?" "Why come here?" Jed asked, his voice still low. "My ranch is the first place he'd look." "I wasn't trying to find you," she admitted. "I was just trying to run the storm. I saw your light and I heard men in town talk. They say you're an honest man, Mr. Stone, that you keep to yourself, that you haven't been in Sheriff Blackwood's pocket since you lost your family." The mention of his family was a punch to the gut. It was true. After Martha and Daniel died, Blackwood had offered condolences, but there was a coldness to it, an impatience, as if Jed's grief was an inconvenience. Jed had withdrawn, and the sheriff had stopped coming around. He stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the black, swirling chaos of the storm. He was a man who craved simplicity. Aara Vance had brought a war to his doorstep. To believe her was to declare war on the most powerful man in the county. To turn her in was to condemn her to hang, and if she was telling the truth, to become an accomplice to murder. He thought of Whisper Creek. Blackwood knew Jed needed a better water source. He'd even offered to help him acquire the Vance land through county auction once it was seized, for a finder's fee. At the time, Jed had thought it was just the sheriff's typical opportunism. Now it looked like something far more sinister. Blackwood hadn't just wanted the silver. He wanted control of all the valuable land. He turned back. He looked at the woman, shivering and shackled. He looked at the damning evidence. And he looked at the empty rocking chair by the fire, where Martha used to sit. His wife had believed in doing right, no matter the cost. For 3 years, he had done nothing but survive. Maybe it was time to do something right again. "All right, Mrs. Vance," Jed said, his voice firm, the decision made. "Let's get those irons off you." This was going to change everything. The dawn broke gray and sullen, the storm having wept itself out overnight. A damp chill clung to the air. Inside Jed's cabin, a tense quiet settled. He'd managed to pry the manacles from Aara's raw wrists, the sharp clang of metal on metal echoing the finality of his decision. He gave her one of Martha's old dresses, a simple calico that hung loosely on her frame. She now sat at his small kitchen table, nursing a tin cup of hot black coffee. The color had returned to her cheeks, but the fear in her eyes was a constant, flickering flame. The incriminating items from the sack were wrapped in oilcloth, tucked beneath a loose floorboard under Jed's bed. "He'll come here," Aara said, her voice barely a murmur. "He has to. This is the last direction I was heading." "Let him come," Jed replied, checking the action on his Winchester rifle. The familiar weight of the weapon was a small comfort. "This is my land. He can't search it without a federal warrant, and he knows it." "You don't know him, Mr. Stone. He doesn't care about the law. He is the law in this valley." Her words were prophetic. Less than an hour later, as Jed was pitching hay in the barn, he saw them. 3 riders cresting the ridge to the east. Even at a distance, the lead rider's posture was unmistakable. It was Sheriff Corbin Blackwood. Jed's heart hammered against his ribs. "Get in the loft," he hissed to Aara. "Stay down and stay quiet, no matter what you hear." She scrambled up the ladder just as the riders trotted into the yard. Blackwood dismounted with practiced ease, his spurs jingling a cheerful, deadly tune. He was a handsome man in a severe way, with a neat black mustache and eyes like chips of obsidian. He smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "Morning, Jedediah," Blackwood called, his voice a smooth baritone. "Quite a blow we had last night." "Corbin," Jed nodded, leaning on his pitchfork, forcing a casualness he didn't feel. "Lost a few shingles." "We're tracking a fugitive," Blackwood said, getting straight to the point. He gestured to the 2 grim-faced deputies behind him. "A woman, dangerous piece of work, murdered her husband and a deputy. You might have heard of her. Aara Vance." Jed kept his face a neutral mask. News traveled slow out here. Blackwood's gaze swept the ranch yard, lingering on the barn, the house, the corral. It was the look of a predator surveying its territory. "She was spotted heading this way late yesterday, riding a fine chestnut stolen from my stables. We found the horse this morning down by the creek, its leg broken. Had to put it down." Jed's stomach clenched. He'd found the chestnut's empty stall that morning. Aara must have let it go in the night, hoping to throw off the trail. A smart move, but a costly one. "Haven't seen anyone, Corbin," Jed said, his voice level. "Just me and the storm." Blackwood took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "You know, Jed, a man in your position, alone out here, you can get lonely. A pretty face shows up telling a sob story. It can cloud a man's judgment." He let the insinuation hang in the air. "My judgment is clear as a bell," Jed replied, his grip tightening on the pitchfork. The sheriff chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He walked past Jed and peered into the main room of the ranch house through the open door. His eyes scanned the interior. Jed prayed he hadn't left any sign of Aara's presence. A stray hairpin, a cup he'd forgotten to wash. "You've got 2 cups on your table, Jed," Blackwood observed, casually turning back. "Expecting company?" Ice flowed through Jed's veins. He'd been so focused on the big picture, he'd missed the small detail. "Felt like a 2-cup morning after the storm," he lied, hoping it sounded plausible. Blackwood's smile widened, all teeth. "Of course. Well, harboring a fugitive is a serious crime, a hanging offense. I'd hate to see an old friend swing for a murdering witch." He paused, letting the threat sink in. "If you see anything, you send word to me, immediately." "You know I will, Sheriff," Jed said, the lie tasting foul. Blackwood held his gaze for a long moment, a silent battle of wills passing between them. Jed didn't flinch. Finally, the sheriff grunted, satisfied for the moment. He turned to mount his horse. "Miller!" Blackwood called to the younger of his 2 deputies. "You stay here. Keep an eye on the southern approach. The rest of us will circle around the west ridge. If she doubles back, I want to know." The deputy, a young man named Ben Miller, with earnest eyes and a face that hadn't yet hardened, looked surprised. "Here, Sheriff. By myself?" "You have your orders," Blackwood snapped, his voice losing its charming veneer. He spurred his horse, and with his other man, rode off, leaving Deputy Miller alone in Jed's yard. The young deputy looked uncomfortable, clearly embarrassed to be posted as a guard on a man like Jedediah Stone. "Sorry about this, Mr. Stone. Orders are orders." "I understand, son," Jed said, his mind racing. The noose was tightening. Blackwood hadn't believed him. Not for a second. Leaving the deputy wasn't just about watching for Aara. It was about watching him. He was a prisoner on his own land. What would Jed do now? After the deputy had taken up a position on a small rise overlooking the ranch, Jed went back into the barn. He looked up at the loft. "He's gone," he said quietly. "But he left a watchdog." Aara climbed down, her face ashen. "He knows. He knows I'm here." "He suspects," Jed corrected her, though he felt the same cold certainty she did. "And he's laid a trap for me. He wants me to make a mistake." They stood in the dusty, quiet barn, the smell of hay and horses filling the air. The vast Montana landscape, usually a symbol of freedom, now felt like the walls of a cage. Blackwood's shadow loomed over Stone's Throw, and Jed knew this was no longer a simple matter of hiding a fugitive. This was a siege, and a siege could only end one of two ways, with victory or with total destruction. 2 days passed under the watchful eye of Deputy Ben Miller. Jed went about his chores with a deliberate, unhurried pace, every action a performance for the young lawman on the hill. He mended the fences Blackwood's horse had passed, reshod his own mare, and cleared fallen branches, all the while acutely aware of the pair of eyes on his back. Aara remained hidden, a ghost in his house, moving from the loft to the root cellar, never daring to show her face at a window. The strain was beginning to wear on them both. Jed knew he couldn't wait for Blackwood to make the next move. He had to act. He had to verify Aara's story, find some piece of external proof that would turn her desperate tale into a hard fact. The answer lay in the town of Redemption. On the morning of the third day, he saddled his horse. He strode out to where Deputy Miller was hunkered down, trying to stay warm in the crisp morning air. "I'm riding into town," Jed announced, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Need supplies. You can ride alongside me if you like, but I'm going." Miller, who looked tired and miserable, shifted uncomfortably. "The sheriff said for me to stay put." "The sheriff said to watch the southern approach," Jed countered, pointing. "The road to redemption is east. She won't be going that way. Besides, if I'm with you, you'll know I'm not up to anything, won't you?" The young deputy, clearly out of his depth, relented. The ride to town was mostly silent, the tension thick between them. Jed decided to take a gamble. "You knew Deputy Miller, didn't you?" Jed asked casually. Not the one Blackwood had posted, but the one whose badge was hidden under his floorboards. The one who drowned. Ben Miller visibly stiffened. "Tom." "Yes, sir. We came up together. Tom Miller. No relation, just a coincidence of name." "Tragic thing," Jed mused. "Good swimmer, was he?" Ben hesitated. "Best in the county. Won a medal for it at the fair 2 years back. That's what made it so strange." He fell silent as if realizing he'd said too much. Jed filed the information away. A seed of doubt planted. Could this young deputy be turned? Redemption was a dusty collection of clapboard buildings lining a single main street. Jed tied his horse in front of the general store, telling the deputy he'd be an hour. His first stop, however, was not the store. It was Doc Abernathy's office. Elias Abernathy was a man whose face was as wrinkled as a dried apple, with shrewd, intelligent eyes that had seen more of life and death than anyone else in the valley. He was also a man who disliked Sheriff Blackwood on principle. "Jedediah," the doctor greeted him, peering over his spectacles. "Don't tell me that old bull finally gored you." "Not yet, Doc. I need to ask you something off the record." Jed asked about Augustus Vance's death. The doctor's office had served as the town's temporary morgue. Doc Abernathy took off his spectacles and began polishing them with a handkerchief. "The official report, signed by me at Sheriff Blackwood's urging, said Mr. Vance suffered a fatal gunshot wound from his own rifle. A cleaning accident." "And unofficially?" Jed pressed. The doctor leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Unofficially, the entry wound was from a .44 caliber pistol fired from a distance, not a rifle. And the powder burns were all wrong for a self-inflicted accident. Furthermore," he added, "there were contusions on his head and defensive wounds on his arms. The man was in a fight before he died." "Did you tell Blackwood this?" "I tried to," Abernathy scoffed. "He told me not to complicate things. He said the man's widow had fled, which was a clear sign of guilt, and a simple story was best for everyone. He made it clear that my continued practice in this town depended on my cooperation." Jed felt a surge of validation. Aara's story was lining up. Doc Abernathy's testimony was powerful, but it was still one man's word against the sheriff's. He needed something tangible. He needed to see the deed. His next stop was the county records office, a stuffy little room in the back of the courthouse. He greeted the clerk, a balding man named Peters, and made up a story about a dispute over the property line of his northern pasture. "I just need to see the official map and the deed for the adjoining property," Jed said smoothly. "The old Vance place." Peters, grumbling about the paperwork, eventually produced a large, bound ledger. He opened it to the page for the Vance property. A new deed had been filed 2 months prior. The property, having no legal heir due to Aara's status as a wanted fugitive, had been transferred to the county's custodianship to be sold at public auction. The signature at the bottom was Augustus Vance's, or so it claimed. Before leaving his ranch, Jed had taken the bloody deed from its hiding place, and on a separate piece of thin paper, had carefully traced the signature of Augustus Vance. Now, in the dim light of the records office, he discreetly pulled the tracing from his pocket. He held it below the ledge of the counter, comparing it with the signature in the ledger. They weren't even close. The signature on the deed in his possession was fluid, confident, with a distinctive flourish on the V. The signature in the county ledger was stilted, hesitant. It was a forgery, and a clumsy one at that. Blackwood, in his haste to legitimize the seizure of the land, had faked the document. Jed's heart pounded. This was it. Hard proof. He thanked the clerk and walked out into the sunlight, blinking like a man emerging from a cave. He had what he needed. As he was loading sacks of flour and beans into his saddlebags at the general store, Deputy Ben Miller approached him, his expression troubled. "Mr. Stone," the young man began, his voice low, "what you asked about Tom Miller?" "Why?" Jed looked the deputy square in the eye. He saw not a henchman, but a confused kid wearing a badge that was too heavy for him. He decided to plant another seed. "Because Tom was a good man," Jed said simply, "and I've heard things that suggest his death wasn't an accident. The sheriff seems awfully keen on this Vance woman, almost desperate. Makes a man wonder what he's so afraid she might say." He didn't wait for a reply. He swung into his saddle and started the ride back to the ranch, leaving Deputy Miller standing in the middle of the dusty street, a storm of doubt gathering in his young eyes. Jed knew he had armed himself with the truth, but in a war against a man like Blackwood, the truth was often the most dangerous weapon of all. This was about to get ugly. The atmosphere at Stone's Throw had shifted. The return from redemption with tangible proof, Doc Abernathy's suppressed findings, the confirmed forgery, had transformed the dynamic between Jed and Aara. They were no longer just a rancher and a fugitive. They were co-conspirators, partners in a perilous venture. The fear was still present, a constant undercurrent, but now it was sharpened by a sliver of hope and a shared sense of purpose. They spent the evening at the kitchen table, the lamp casting a warm glow over their hushed conversation. Aara, having been confined for days, seemed to draw strength from Jed's discoveries. "Doc Abernathy always said Augustus was a fool to trust anyone in this valley," she recalled softly, a sad smile touching her lips. "He liked the doctor, said he was the only man here without dollar signs in his eyes." "He's a good man," Jed affirmed, "but he's old. Blackwood could ruin him." A bond was quietly forming between them, woven from threads of shared danger and mutual respect. Jed saw not a black widow, but a resilient, intelligent woman, robbed of her husband and her future. Aara saw not just a stoic, grieving rancher, but a man of deep, unshakable integrity, willing to risk everything for what was right. He found himself noticing the way the firelight caught the gold in her hair, the intelligence in her green eyes. He was feeling things he thought had been buried with Martha. Their planning was interrupted late the next night by a soft but urgent knocking at the door. Jed grabbed his Winchester, his heart leaping into his throat. Aara flattened herself against the far wall, out of sight. "Who's there?" Jed called out, his voice a low growl. "Mr. Stone, it's Deputy Miller, Ben Miller. I need to talk to you alone." Jed hesitated. Was this a trap? Had Blackwood sent the boy to trick his way inside? He cracked the door open a few inches, the barrel of the rifle still visible. Deputy Miller stood on the porch, his hat in his hands. He was pale and agitated, his eyes wide and darting nervously into the darkness behind him. He wasn't wearing his gun belt. "What do you want, deputy?" "What you said in town about Tom Miller," he stammered. "It got me thinking. The sheriff, he's been acting strange ever since Tom died. Jumpy, angry, and the way he's obsessed with Mrs. Vance." He took a deep breath. "Tonight a writer came from Redemption, a man I've seen before, a hired gun named Silas Croft. He and the sheriff were talking. They thought I was asleep." Miller's voice dropped to a near whisper. "I heard them. Croft asked Blackwood what he wanted done about you. The sheriff said, 'Give it another day. If Stone doesn't break, we'll have to tie up loose ends.' Then he mentioned your ranch and the woman. He told Croft to be ready." Jed's blood ran cold. Blackwood was done waiting. He was preparing to eliminate them all. "That's not all," Miller continued, his words tumbling out. "After Croft left, I went through Tom's things. The sheriff gave me his box of personals to send back to his family. I never did. I found a letter Tom had been writing to his sister. It was unfinished." The deputy pulled a folded, creased piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to Jed. "Read it." Jed took the letter, closing the door behind him. By the lamplight, with Aara looking over his shoulder, he read Tom Miller's last words. The young deputy wrote of his unease about how Sheriff Blackwood was getting involved in something dark and greedy with the rich Easterner, Augustus Vance. The last line was chilling. "He wants me to ride out with him to the Vance place tomorrow. He says we're going to make Mr. Vance see reason. I have a bad feeling about this, Sarah. A real bad feeling." It was a confession from the grave. This letter, combined with the forged deed and Doc Abernathy's testimony, was an ironclad case. Ben Miller had risked everything by coming here. He had crossed the line from lawman to defector. "He's going to kill you too, son," Jed said, looking at the young man who had followed him inside. "For what you heard, for what you know." Miller nodded, swallowing hard. "I know. I'm no killer, Mr. Stone. I signed up to keep the peace, not to be a rich man's bully. Tom was my friend. What Blackwood did to him, to the Vances, it's wrong." In that moment, their small conspiracy of two became an alliance of three. "We can't run," Aara said, her voice steady and clear. "Even if we get away, he'll hunt us. He'll never stop. We have to expose him." "How?" Miller asked, looking helpless. "He owns this county. Every judge, every official." "Not everyone," Jed said, a plan beginning to form in his mind. He looked at the calendar on his wall, the one he used to track cattle shipments. "Territorial Marshal Elias Thorne. He passes through Fort Ellis on the 1st of every month to pick up federal prisoners. That's 5 days from now." Fort Ellis was a 2-day ride away. If they could get the evidence and a witness to Marshal Thorne, Blackwood's reign would be over. Thorne was a legend, a man known to be as incorruptible as he was relentless. "It's too risky to make a run for it," Aara countered. "Blackwood is watching every road." "Then we don't run," Jed said, a grim look on his face. "We bring the marshal here, and we set a trap for the sheriff. We'll use the one thing he can't resist as bait." Aara and Miller looked at him, confused. "Greed," Jed explained. "We're going to make him believe we're going for the silver." The plan was audacious, dangerous, and likely to get them all killed. But as they looked at each other in the flickering lamplight of the cabin, the rancher, the fugitive, and the rogue deputy, they knew it was their only chance. They would turn Jed's ranch into a crucible, forcing a final, violent confrontation that would either lead to their redemption or their graves. The stakes couldn't be higher. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in deception. The first part of the plan fell to Jed's most trusted ranch hand, an old, wiry cowboy named Silas, who lived on the far side of the property and was fiercely loyal. Under the cover of darkness, Jed sent Silas on the perilous journey to Fort Ellis with a carefully worded letter for Marshal Elias Thorne, outlining the evidence and the urgency. It was a long shot, trusting that the marshal would believe him and act swiftly. The second part of the plan was the trap itself. This fell to Deputy Ben Miller. He returned to his post before sunrise, feigning ignorance. Later that day, he rode frantically into Redemption, finding Sheriff Blackwood at the saloon. Playing the part of a man who had broken under pressure, Miller confessed. "I couldn't take it anymore, Sheriff," he said, his performance convincing enough to earn him a glass of whiskey from Blackwood. "Stone's been hiding her the whole time. I beat it out of him. He and the Vance woman, they're planning to run tonight. But first they're going to the old Vance cabin to dig up a stash of silver Augustus Vance buried before he died. They figured to take it and disappear into the territories." Blackwood's obsidian eyes lit up with avarice. The silver. He had assumed the mine was the only prize, but a hidden stash was an immediate reward. It was too perfect, too tempting to resist. His arrogance wouldn't allow him to see the trap. "You did good, son," Blackwood said, clapping Miller on the shoulder, the gesture both a commendation and a threat. "You and I and Mr. Croft will ride out there tonight. We'll catch them red-handed, and with no witnesses we can finally close this messy chapter." The trap was set. The location was the derelict Vance cabin, which stood a few hundred yards from the entrance to the hidden silver mine. It was a place of ghosts and bad memories for Aara, but its isolation made it the perfect stage. As dust settled, casting long purple shadows across the valley, Jed and Aara rode to the cabin. The air was cold and still. Inside, the cabin was a wreck, a testament to the violence that had occurred there. A dark stain, her husband's blood, was still visible on the floorboards. Aara steeled herself, her face a mask of determination. "I never thought I'd come back here," she said quietly. "We'll make a new memory for this place tonight," Jed promised, his hand briefly touching hers. They didn't have to wait long. Just as the moon climbed over the jagged peaks, they heard the sound of approaching horses. 3 riders: Blackwood, the hired gun Silas Croft, a man with a cruel face and dead eyes, and Ben Miller, who was playing his part perfectly, looking nervous and subservient. "Stone! Vance!" Blackwood's voice boomed through the night. "I know you're in there. Come on out with your hands up. It's over." Jed opened the cabin door and stepped out onto the porch, his hands held high. The moonlight glinted off the rifle held loosely in Blackwood's hand. "It's just me, Corbin," Jed said calmly. "The woman's gone. Took the silver and ran. Left me high and dry." Blackwood laughed, a harsh grating sound. "You're a terrible liar, Jedediah. Croft, check the cabin." The hired gun dismounted and swaggered toward the porch, a long-barreled Colt in his hand. As he stepped into the doorway, Aara, who had been hiding behind the door, swung a heavy piece of firewood, striking Croft hard across the back of his knees. The gunman howled and crumpled to the floor. At the same instant, Jed dropped his hands and drew the Colt peacemaker that had been tucked into the back of his belt. "It's over, Blackwood." Blackwood, shocked by the sudden turn, reacted with pure killer instinct. He fired his rifle, not at Jed, but at Ben Miller. The young deputy cried out and fell from his saddle, clutching a bloody shoulder. He had served his purpose. He was now just another loose end. "You fool!" Blackwood snarled, leveraging his rifle towards Jed. "Did you really think you could outsmart me?" He squeezed the trigger, but Jed had already dived from the porch, rolling into the dirt as splinters exploded from the spot where he'd been standing. From inside the cabin, Aara emerged, holding an old shotgun Jed had given her. She fired both barrels over Blackwood's head, the blast echoing like a cannon through the silent hills. The sheriff's horse reared in panic, throwing him to the ground. The night erupted into a chaotic symphony of gunfire and shouting. Jed, using an old water trough for cover, exchanged shots with Blackwood, who had scrambled behind his fallen horse. Croft, crawling from the cabin, tried to get a beat on Aara, but Jed's next shot caught the gunman in the arm, sending his pistol flying into the darkness. "You have nowhere to run, Blackwood," Jed yelled. "It's finished. I have the real deed. I have Tom Miller's last letter. It's all over." Blackwood laughed, a ragged, desperate sound. "Your proof. Your word against a decorated sheriff? No one will ever believe you." "You're right," a new voice said, calm and resonant, cutting through the chaos. "His word alone might not be enough." From the dark shadows of the pine trees surrounding the clearing, 2 figures emerged. One was Doc Abernathy, holding a lantern high. The other was a tall, imposing man with a silver mustache and a weary, knowing expression. He wore a long duster, and pinned to his vest was the unmistakable star of a United States Territorial Marshal. "Corbin Blackwood," Marshal Elias Thorne said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. You're under arrest for the murders of Augustus Vance and Deputy Thomas Miller, and for conspiracy to commit murder against these citizens." Blackwood stared, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He was cornered, his empire of lies crumbling around him. With a final desperate roar, he raised his pistol to fire at the marshal. 3 shots rang out almost as one. One from Jed's Colt, one from Aara's reloaded shotgun, and one from the marshal's service revolver. Corbin Blackwood staggered, his pistol falling from his hand. He looked down at the red blossoms spreading across his chest, a look of profound surprise on his face, before collapsing into the dust. Silence fell, absolute and profound. The devil's gambit had been won. What an unbelievable twist. The aftermath was quiet and methodical. Marshal Thorne, a man who had seen his share of frontier justice, took charge with grim efficiency. The hired gun, Croft, was bound and gagged, his wounded pride hurting more than his arm. Ben Miller, clutching his bleeding shoulder, gave a full and formal statement to the marshal, his words clear and steady despite the pain. Doc Abernathy tended to the young deputy's wound, praising his courage. The body of Corbin Blackwood lay in the moonlight, a final, stark testament to the greed that had consumed him. There was no glory in his death, only a quiet, pathetic end to a reign of terror. Marshal Thorne listened intently as Jed and Aara recounted their story, occasionally nodding as they presented the evidence. The bloodstained deed, the forged county record Jed had discovered, and Tom Miller's heartbreaking final letter. "I received your man's message, Mr. Stone," Thorne said, his gravelly voice holding a note of respect. "It was compelling. I decided to expedite my travel. It seems I arrived just in time." He looked from Jed to Aara, his gaze lingering on her for a moment. "Mrs. Vance, on behalf of the Montana Territory, I apologize for what you've endured. Your name will be cleared. Your property will be restored to you, effective immediately." For the first time since she collapsed at his gate, Aara let the dam of her composure break. Tears of relief, of grief for her husband, of gratitude streamed down her face. Jed stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, a silent anchor in the storm that had finally passed. In the days that followed, the truth spread through redemption like a cleansing fire. The story of Sheriff Blackwood's corruption, his cold-blooded murders, and elaborate deceptions shocked the community to its core. The town had been living under the shadow of a monster they had mistaken for a guardian. Marshal Thorne stayed for a week, conducting a thorough investigation that unearthed a web of graft and intimidation orchestrated by Blackwood. Several town officials quietly resigned. When the marshal finally rode out, taking Croft with him to face federal charges, he left a different town behind. Ben Miller, his arm in a sling but his spirit intact, was appointed acting sheriff by the marshal, tasked with the monumental job of restoring faith in the law. It was a burden he accepted with a humility and seriousness that promised a better future for redemption. Aara Vance was no longer a fugitive. She was the owner of one of the richest silver claims in the territory. Many expected her to sell the land and return to the more civilized world back east, to put the trauma of the West behind her. But she surprised them all. One evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and rose, she found Jed on his porch, looking out over his land. "I'm not leaving," she said, standing beside him. Jed looked at her. "This is a hard country, Aara." "I'm a hard woman, Jedediah," she replied with a small smile. "This land cost my husband his life. I'm not going to let his dream die with him. I plan to work that mine." She paused, then turned to face him fully. "But I can't do it alone. I need a partner, someone honest, someone who isn't afraid of a little trouble, someone I can trust with my life." The offer hung in the air between them, meaning more than just business. It was an offer of a shared future, of building something new from the ashes of their painful past. Jed looked at his ranch, his fortress of solitude. It no longer felt like a shelter from grief, but like a prison he had built for himself. For 3 years, he had been simply existing. Aara Vance had brought chaos and danger to his door, but she had also brought him back to life. He looked at her, at the strength and fire in her eyes, and saw not a complication, but a new beginning. "I reckon I'm your man," he said, his voice soft. A genuine smile, the first in a long time, reached his eyes, chasing away the last of the wintry shadows. They stood together on the porch, two survivors looking out as the last light of day faded. Before them, their lands stretched out, now joined by a common purpose. The world was still wild and unpredictable, but for the first time in a long time, for both of them, it was also full of hope. In a place a stone's throw from damnation, they had found their own redemption. And so, the shadows over stone's throw and redemption finally receded, burned away by the courage of ordinary people who refused to let evil triumph. The story of Jedediah Stone and Aara Vance isn't just a tale of shootouts and silver mines. It's a reminder that true grit isn't about how fast you can draw a gun, but about the willingness to stand for what's right, even when you're standing alone. It shows us that even in the deepest grief, the heart can find a new reason to beat, and that alliances can be forged in the most unexpected of places. They faced down a corrupt sheriff in a rigged system, proving that the truth, when armed with courage, is the most powerful weapon in the Wild West. If this story of justice and redemption in the untamed frontier resonated with you, please help our channel grow by giving this video a like. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you won't miss our next journey into the heart of the Old West. And please share this story with someone who loves a classic tale of grit and honor. Thank you for listening.